talking about today, our capacity is $55 million. We pay it out of our debt service fund, and that's the capacity without a tax increase, or I should say, another revenue source. We would have to have another revenue source to borrow more than $55 million. Okay. But there would be a capacity issue with the collateral. I don't have those numbers with me right now, but we're not at that point. We have collateral to borrow 55.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you. Did I miss something? Is there a term called two-thirds bonds?
There are two-thirds bonds, and we do every other year issue two-thirds bonds, and they don't require voter approval. They are based on the previous two-thirds net debt reduction. So basically, it's two-thirds of your principal payments that you made in the previous year, you can issue in a future year.
Reissue our payments, basically.
Right. Right.
But you still ratchet it down, because if you paid off $1 million, you could borrow
Exactly.
$700,000.
Right, right.
You ratchet it down.
Exactly.
Any other questions, comments?
One.
Oh, excuse me, Mr.
Thank you. Just a question on timing. Given that rates are rising, and I'm sure that our rate versus a commercial lending rate would be much better, but is speed of the essence, and can you lock into any kind of a rate, or how does that work as far as getting this approved and starting the process and getting a better rate than today than we would 6 months
Sure.
ago?
Well, first of all, I don't think you time the rate when you don't need the money. So I never borrow the money, or we, the city, never borrows the money till we know we're going to need the money. So for example, if you voted to approve $55 million today, I'd guess that it would be a year before we borrow it, because we don't want to start paying debt service on something we've not even started construction on yet. So I wouldn't advise on borrowing the money ahead of time.
You take what you get,
Exactly.
whatever the rate is.
And another thing, the local government commission, when you go to borrow the money, they're going to want to know what contracts you have to use. There's all sorts of documentation that they would require that you'd have to present to actually borrow the money. So
Okay.
Until you're ready to spend it, you're not going to borrow it.
Thank you.
The local government commission is not a rubber stamp, and it was put in the Great Depression, so people say, well, if someone in North Carolina's borrowing money, it's been looked at with a sharp pencil.
That's right.
And it's, as I say, it's not a rubber stamp, and oftentimes they come back with a lot of questions. Anyway, thank you, ma'am. I'm sorry to
You're
hit
welcome.
you
That's okay.
unexpectedly. Mr. Tesh, oh, excuse me. One more question. Yeah,
One
go
more
ahead.
question. Could you provide us with a total list of all of the debt that the city
Sure.
is involved in?
Yes.
We may see that sooner
Yeah,
than you
yeah,
think.
it's being worked on. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
Mr. Tesh, I don't know if you had that in yet, but I think it's important for everybody to understand there's a lot of different places we get money from, and they're all a little different.
Different buckets.
Different buckets. Mr. Tesh, you have the floor.
Thank you, and good evening, Chairman Clark, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, and members of the City Council.
Good evening.
Chairman Clark did ask that question about total debt, and Finance Department is already working on it. It will be in the response packet early next week. As Mr. Garrity said, we spent Tuesday talking about the operating budget and total budget summary, and we'll spend the majority of today talking about the capital budget, specifically looking at the proposed package of $55 million in limited obligation bonds that Ms. Saunders has talked about here as a financing source. So this presentation is going to talk about kind of in two sections the proposed capital plan. So we'll talk about the LOBS package, and then we'll talk about kind of everything else that would have been part of our normal capital planning process had we not had this LOBS package in it. It is a little unusual for us to talk about a bond package in the middle of our capital planning process like this, and other times those processes have happened and we've actually done the budgets via amendment later in the year. So as we talked about on Tuesday, it does make the total budget look larger than it normally would in a year. Also spend some time talking about unfunded capital needs. We did spend a good bit of time in the March meeting talking about that, so I won't waste your time going through it in great detail, but just talk at a summary level again. For the public generally, what is the capital plan? Kind of an introduction here. It's a 6-year plan where the first year in the plan is in the actual budget, and the other 5 years are just planning for what we would appropriate potentially in the next 5 years. So every year as you roll forward, that first year of the plan becomes the budget, and every year is just a planning year afterwards. What does the capital plan fund? As you see down there in the bullet points, really major construction, land purchases, and stimulation of economic development through projects. So we're really talking about things generally that have a cost of $50,000, $100,000 or more in a useful life of 10 years or more. These are our larger scale projects and maintenances for the most part. So the 2023-2028 capital plan itself, as we talked about in March, is going to focus very heavily because of that $55 million LOB package on critical infrastructure maintenance, specifically in transportation, as well as a lot for our livable neighborhoods area in recreation, where you see some of those maintenance and improvements to various quality of life assets throughout the entire city. As we talked about in March, there are a couple of what we called must-fund projects, but we have the Major League Baseball requirements for the downtown ballpark at Truist Stadium. So we have an amount in the LOBS package for that, as well as the upfit of the 911 Communications Center that has gone through Public Safety Committee here recently. That package also includes a few other new items as well, but we are going to go through that entire package, focus area by focus area here, and actually spend a substantial part of this meeting talking about the LOBS package. So at a very high level, how does that $55 million break down? Roughly a third in quality transportation, so we're looking there, bridges, sidewalks, street resurfacing, those kinds of things. Livable neighborhoods, that is really, as we talked about, the Recreation and Parks Department. So there are a lot of deferred maintenance projects as well as improvements to various park amenities. And then in Economic Vitality and Diversity, you will see the Transformational Job Training Center as well as our public assembly facilities fall into EVD. So the money that you saw for the Major League Baseball improvements, that $5 million falls into EVD as well as a few other things at the fairgrounds. Smaller amounts in service excellence, and again, we'll go through this, but about almost all of that $5 million is for a roof replacement at the Joyce & Johnson Municipal Services Building over on Lowry Street, and that $1.25 million is what we talked about for the Public Safety Center upgrades. It will be at the county building. So for EVD, Economic Vitality and Diversity, these should be in alphabetical order, the same way that you see them in your capital plan. But $6 million for that Transformational Job Training Center. There have been different presentations to the City Council information items on this. Would be in the Northeast Ward. You see minor improvements for Bowman Gray Stadium. That's some HVAC work and a couple of other things that are needed over there. Fairgrounds renovations at $3.5 million. There was a master plan done several years back that had more than $20 million worth of improvements to the facilities. With inflation and where the market is now, that number would be north of $30 million easily. So a small amount of some of those critical improvements being made. And then again, $5 million for the downtown ballpark for what we think is coming from Major League Baseball. We're still working on those numbers, so this is somewhat of a placeholder for now, hoping that it's the correct amount.
Scott, if I can interrupt for just a second. So each one of these items will come to us for approval. I mean, we're not rubber stamping anything here and saying we're giving $5 million. We're approving however it's going to be spent in a ballpark. We'll have oversight over how this money actually goes out, correct?
So in terms of, just like you do with every other capital project, anything over $100,000, the council will have as an action item to let the contract for, absolutely.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, I have a very difficult time seeing folks with all this up here, so if you have a question, just shout it out. Thank you.
You get ready to lose control.
Moving on from Economic Vitality and Diversity, again, the 911 center upgrades at $1.25 million. I've talked about that in Public Safety Committee in prior months. You see down there the $5 million for the roof replacement at the Joyce & Johnson Municipal Services Center. We do have about $500,000 worth of additional what we would call city yard improvements related to a vehicle and sand storage, an additional salt facility so that the trucks don't have to drive clear across the city when we have winter weather events.
Scott, tell him what building is Joyce & Johnson Center?
I'm sorry, sir?
Everybody knows what building it is.
That is the Lowry Street facility that the city has where many of our field operations are housed.
Out there, you can see it from I-40. Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Parkway.
Excuse me, you can see it from Salem Parkway.
And Scott, I think that when we get that roof replaced, we'll be able to lease that part of the building that's unusable right now because of the roof. Is that right? Or do you know? You may not know that.
Potentially, this is space, well, part of the space where the roof needs replaced is already leased to the recycling company. And then there's a large section of the building that was, we didn't renovate when we renovated about half of it. That's empty, that it would be available for potential leasing. It would take upfit on the inside, but as well as if there are needs that the city has as well. But right now, we're at a point where it's so structurally deteriorated, we need to either replace the roof or tear that whole section of the building
Yes.
down.
Thank you, sir.
So we do have 2 slides on livable neighborhoods. Going through these very quickly, one by one, we do have already designed improvements to the Helen Nichols Park, would include walking trail and some other amenities near the Carl Russell Rec Center. Granville Park improvements that include some drainage issues as well as pathway improvements and other amenities. At Haynes Hosiery, we have improvements to the walking track as well as to the bleachers. Additional amenities at Larry Little Walking Trail Park, or Larry Little Walking Trail at Kimberly Park, would include some new park course equipment, fitness equipment, as well as some additional parking upgrades. Malloy Park, let me not skip over, Long Creek Park improvements is predominantly that money would be allocated towards trail improvements from the cart paths that are out there to create a greenway connector and a loop. There are some pedestrian bridges that would have to be built over some creeks as well. Malloy Park Phase 2, if you'll remember, the state gave us about $400,000 in infrastructure money for this project. It wasn't quite enough to tackle everything that was going to be designed there, so we do have a small set aside to bridge the difference there. Miller Park improvements, $1 million. I know some of these are in different levels of scoping. I do believe that Recreation and Parks Director is still working on some of the design ideas for this and would present those opportunities to City Council for some of these projects. Muddy Creek Greenway repairs, we talked about this one in March. We do have a section of the Greenway that the stream bank is eroding away, so this would be a stream bank stabilization project. Very similar in Runnymede, we have some stormwater issues. This would end up being only a portion of what is a stormwater, water and sewer, and recreation and parks project combined to fix the issues at Runnymede. Improvements and renovations to the interior of the Sprague Street Recreation Center, which could include redoing the kitchen as well as several other interior improvements to bathrooms and other spaces. Winston Lake Golf Course improvements. We have made several contributions to improvements to Winston Lake Golf Course over the course of the last 5 or 7 years from both a capital and operating perspective. This would continue that, provide opportunities for better playability at the golf course, making changes to sand traps, greens, and vegetation as needed. Recreation and parks maintenance projects, so we do see about $4.9 million there. That is to be spread out all over the city. It includes things like ADA accessibility issues, path resurfacing, resurfacing of parking lots at multiple recreation centers, upgrades to tennis courts that are currently non-usable, aesthetics enhancements at all 17 recreation centers, and composite decking at the Salem Lake Pier to cut down on maintenance. So that is really kind of an across-the-board, hits every ward, smaller sum of projects that come together at roughly $5 million. And what you see...
Mr. Tesh, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
I get calls regularly on pickleball. Do we have any pickleball courts, or are we putting any in?
Yes,
Yes.
we do.
We
do?
do
Okay.
have pickleball courts, and we will get that in the response packet for you where they're at, and if we have additional design for any in the future. Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. And then you will see in the recreation section, as well as in the transportation section, what I'm going to refer to as kind of small contingencies based on where the market is right now, $1.2 million here and $1.5 million in transportation to really cover shortfalls from inflation going forward. Hopefully this will be enough. If it's not, that's part of, we had that conversation about general fund balance and the unassigned amount potentially being used for those purposes as well. So $15.7 million total of the $55 million in livable neighborhoods. On the quality transportation side, we have the Brewer Road sidewalk. So that is the city's match for that segment of the sidewalk. Downtown park and management improvements for overall improvements and to hopefully assist with Councilmember Scipio, as you had requested, looking at how do we get a little closer to breaking even with respect to our parking operations. Some of that is in design right now, so this would fund the recommendations that were to come out of that design. The First Street Bridge replacement, this is just a gap funding for what's left on First Street Bridge. It is not the total amount. We are a little bit under budget based on where the economy is. Glade Street Bridge replacement, that is the total construction cost of Glade Street Bridge replacement. Lowry Street repairs and resurfacing, so this is the street itself, the entire segment being torn down and brought back up to the commercial grade that it needs to be. Northwest Boulevard improvements, so these are streetscape improvements to a section of Northwest Boulevard, predominantly in the North Ward. Street resurfacing across the city at $4.5 million, so that would be cut across all 8 wards. Swaim Road Bridge replacement, the full construction cost of the Swaim Road Bridge, and then again, about $1.5 million in contingency, just as a placeholder against some of these projects coming in over budget based on where the economy is right now.
Scott?
Yes, sir.
A couple of questions on this. In Parks and Recreation, there was an amount for kind of yet to be determined needs. On sidewalks specifically, would we be paying for miscellaneous repair and maintenance that need to be done that are not enumerated here?
So this LOBS package does not include miscellaneous repairs for what would be kind of normal, everyday operating repairs to sidewalks. We have been looking at funding those specifically out of savings in the general fund. We've had significant salary savings in our field operations unit, and trying to use some of that for contractual basis to do some of those miscellaneous sidewalk improvements. But there's not a set aside in the LOBS package for additional sidewalk improvements or maintenance.
Okay. And then similar question, the street resurfacing then, this would be over and above what we typically would spend from money from the Powell bill?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Scott,
Yes, sir.
what happened to Old Salisbury Road Bridge? The Old Salisbury Road Bridge that's out right now?
The Old Salisbury Road failure project, that project is going to be fully funded. It's not in the LOBS package. It will be funded with Powell bill fund balance, and we will show it later in the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I thought it was in this package.
There was a memo where we mixed together some of the LOBS package, the general fund funded, and the Powell bill funded projects to show the full package of maintenance that we were putting together. But yes, sir, Councilmember Larson, that project is funded, and we will talk about it here in a few slides. So Lisa has already talked about this, and I won't go any further into the details other than to say, when we were talking about the ability to issue $55 million in limited obligation debt without a tax rate increase, you can see the purple line is basically what the debt service fund reserves look like without issuing this, and the red line is what it looks like with issuing $55 million. And so the question, again, Lisa's already answered, anything above and beyond the $55 million would require additional resources in the form of a property tax rate increase or other allocation of resources. So that's touching on the LOBS package at a very high level. We're going to move into a summary of the capital plan, proposed capital plan. Again, we talked about the draft capital plan in March, so I'm not going to belabor you with the 30 or 40 slides that we had last time. We'll talk about expenditures by focus area. Again, those projects that are funded specifically by general fund balance. And there is an appendix behind this that goes into a little more detail for the public to look at if they would like to see those, or if individual council members would like to talk about those departments or service areas. Looking at the capital plan, this is something that we see most of the time. The healthy environment focus area takes up a majority of what's in the capital plan. That is because of water and sewer, and there's also some substantial projects in solid waste coming as well. So our Winston-Salem Forsyth County Utilities Department is a vast majority, as you see here, 75% or more, or close to it, of both the FY23 capital budget as well as the plan. We will go into the details a little more on these other areas. Looking at it this way, I want to call your attention to a couple of things in the overall table here. One, in the FY23 budget for economic vitality and diversity, there is $1 million worth of fairgrounds fund balance appropriated for specific maintenance, for roof maintenance and some other things that they need. They also have $3.5 million in the LOBS package. The intent is to spend that $3.5 million in the LOBS package first. and then see whether that $1 million additional is still needed. We believe that it is, but we're also going to keep a very close eye on the cash in the Public Assembly Facilities Management Fund with that one. Within the livable neighborhoods area and as well as within our quality transportation area, I would note in fiscal years 24, 26, and 28, you'll see it in service excellence too. Again, we talked about 2/3 bonds being issued every other year. So the spikes that you see every other year are related to those projects. Some of that is facility renewal, general maintenance, or other maintenance within those areas. Again, in healthy environment, we see that that is significantly larger because of our utilities department. We have also, and I will note that this is a difference from the draft plan, the proposed capital plan for the stormwater fund is slightly larger than what we showed in March. It includes appropriations for the projects that Keith Huff, the Traffic Field Operations Director, showed to Public Works Committee last month. We will have to come back to the City Council in the fall to talk about the cash flow situation for the stormwater fund. We have been, for many years, talking about the need to increase the rates, and with those projects having been added to the capital budget, it is going to come time to have that conversation and determine what those rates may need to look like for coming years. One last thing I'll draw your attention to, in quality transportation in FY24, you see that that number is substantially larger. The WISTA is looking at a design plan for potentially needing to do some major renovations to the WISTA admin building. It is, as I understand it, a requirement for us to get it in the capital plan so that they can do the design and ask the feds for money. So it's not in the capital budget. It's simply in a planning year to note that it is something that they are looking at. It is the full cost of the project that you see in there and would have a significant city match to it, but they are doing a design sketch right now.
Where is that building located?
It is located.
That's one on Trey Street?
Yes,
Okay. Not the bus station down?
not Clark Campbell, no. So funding resources, very similar to what we saw on the expenditure side. Reserves here, that's because in our utilities department, they're substantially using their reserves or contributions from the operating fund to fund a majority of the capital improvements to the water and sewer system, as well as in solid waste. Bonds don't show up in 23. This is the non-LOBS list, but you do see that 6.7% bonds in planning years, again, related to those 2/3 appropriations that we have every other year going forward.
Do you have any revenue bonds anticipated in utilities? I see Ms. Saunders shaking her head no. Okay, thank you.
We do have the overall revenue side of the picture here. One of the things that Councilmember Larson and I was going to call out on this is looking at the Powell bill number of roughly $4.6 million in FY23. That includes an appropriation of fund balance for the Old Salisbury Road project. The $2.1 million, as you see thereafter, is just the annual contribution from the state aid program through NCDOT. You see down there at the bottom, again, the water and sewer fund as well as solid waste funds, the amount of their own reserves or operating contributions that they're using, which is why we saw them being 75% roughly of the plan. I want to talk real quickly about those projects. So on Tuesday, we talked about general fund balance appropriation for certain projects. So these are outside the scope of the $55 million, but basically in addition to the LOBS package. We showed the Greenway we showed both greenways in the LOBS package originally. In going back and looking at this, one of them is funded with LOBS, the Virginia Newell-Massey section of the Bow and Branch Greenway being funded with general fund balance here. Also, and again, we have talked about these, but part of the Polo Park gym floor replacement is a waterproofing that's necessary, and the Hanestown Park playground replacement was an immediate need. Do have several things in the fire department. So the first one related to washers, dryers, and extractors for their equipment to keep the chemicals on their turnout gear from getting into their normal wash, fuel tank replacement, and then a signal modifier out there at Station 10 on Jonestown. In the transportation section, I believe Rod Ring came forward a month or two ago at Public Works Committee and talked about street lighting and the needs that we had there. So $600,000 to replace different types of street lights along different corridors throughout the city. And then here, what you see is $550,000 for the Lakeview Drive Bridge replacement. This is just the gap component of it. The construction of that project will be fully funded. We are using project balances to cover the rest of it, so an appropriation of general fund balance just to get you to the full amount needed for the entire construction of that bridge. And then generally $400,000 here. The city has for several years been looking at facility security improvement upgrades. We did have our CIO come and talk about additional cameras in many spaces throughout the city. So as we have opportunities to make those improvements, having a funding source available for that as well. Very briefly on the unfunded list, I didn't change the pictures from March. I thought it was a good juxtaposition to say that some of these pictures are actually things that are in the proposed LOBS package. So we talked about it, and some of the things that are unfunded are going to be funded. At a very high level, $1.3 billion, quality transportation being $1 billion of it. Going down from there, a large portion of livable neighborhoods is related to affordable housing needs. What's in safe and secure community, a majority of that are requests from the fire department for additional fire stations that may be needed in the future. And I will flip to the next page, and I think it's easier to see this a little bit as a summary and breakout. Again, if you look at sidewalk construction and repair at $500 million, the road improvement projects and street resurfacing, those first three on the list, and then jump over and grab also the urban circulator and the other road, bike, and ped improvements, that's $1 billion of the list is just in sidewalks, roads, the urban circulator, and some of the other improvements to our transportation infrastructure. Again, we see affordable housing there at roughly $83 million, and so on down the list. Being on the unfunded section, these are things where if you were looking at a general obligation bond referendum in '24, we would be looking at things on this list. It includes the one-on-one conversations that we had with City Council over the last 3 or 4 months, but this would be the starting point for talking about a bond referendum in '24.
Mr. Tesh,
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Scipio?
with the unfunded request, how are we being diligent in looking at some of the federal money that's been set aside for infrastructure?
Yes,
That
ma'am.
some of these might be able to be funded through?
I think every opportunity we have, specifically when it comes to transportation infrastructure through BIL, we are talking with Leslie Mozingo. We have a group of the management team that is looking at those opportunities. So every one of those that comes across our plate where we have a project that already fits it, absolutely, that's something that we're going to be looking at.
As a matter of fact, Councilmember Clark and I and Meredith met with Leslie today and pushed a lot of those same buttons about, are we turning over every rock for every dollar that's available? And came up with some ideas that she hadn't thought of and vice versa. So I think we're doing very good diligence there.
Yeah. I will say, and Ms. Martins is our staff person that's the front in the contact with Ms. Mazzilli. She is our Washington lobbyist. I think she does a very good job of keeping us abreast of what's out there from potential pots of money that we can use. And we did spend probably over 2 hours with her today going over all that. And I think she's very good at identifying it, and then it's kind of up to us to be sure we fill the forms out right and this, that, and the other. But we're working it diligently. Thank you. Any other questions right now? Okay, please continue, Mr. Tesh.
So that substantially ends the presentation. Again, there are additional slides beyond that. They are an appendix and have kind of summary level details by service area or department, somewhat of an excerpt from the capital plan. But that really hits the high levels in terms of the LOBS package, as well as at a summary level, what's in the 6-year capital plan outside the $55 million.
Mr. Tesh, I know a number of folks, including myself, have given you questions on the side. When do you anticipate issuing your first packet of responses?
Our intent is to have that first packet of responses out Tuesday by close of business. We have heard from you, Councilmember Clark, and from a couple of others, but we're waiting to see if additional questions come that need to be responded to this evening and try and get those answered as quickly as we can and get that out the door to you next week in advance of the Thursday meeting next week.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
I would mention, if I can take 1 second, I did send you a number of them, but there's 2 I'd like to comment on that I've asked for that are really beyond the budget. And the first one has to do with our carbon footprint, whatever you want to call it, but I've asked for a report of, how are we doing on that? I understand we do calculate it each year based on the gallons of gas we use and electricity, this, that, and the other, to see how that has tracked over the last few years. Incorporated in that, the recycling costs doubled or tripled this year. It was just a huge number. I've asked them to generate a carbon footprint of the recycling program, what it costs to run those trucks, what it costs to separate it. I don't know if y'all are aware, but 30% of what we pick up on the street and haul to the recycling center is then hauled to the landfill. So I've asked for a look at the carbon footprint on that as well. The other area is, and thankfully Mr. Bessie isn't here, so I won't have to have an argument with him. But our bus system for this year and next year, and I just take those as examples, is carrying less than half of what it did 10 years ago. And I think we need to take a fundamental look, and there's, I guess Mr. McIntosh, your committee will be the ones looking at it, but are we doing what we need to be doing to be sure we're providing quality transportation in that area for the people that need it? For some reason, the percent that rides the bus continues to go down. If you were to take the last 30 years and say what were the 10 lowest years, well, they're the last 10 years. We've been in steady decline for quite a while, and it is beyond, I think, recessions and COVID and things like that. It is continuing to diminish. So those are just two areas that I don't expect us to make any decisions on that during the budget, but I think it's worth asking the question of. Ms. Scipio, I also asked them for a list of all the money we owe. I think it's good to look at the balance sheet to know, it's as Ms. Saunders pointed out, we got GO bonds, we got revenue bonds, we got LOBs and TOBs and everything else. And
Government money,
and what's that?
government money.
Yeah. And just to have a feel, because if you look at our balance sheet, we have, I'm looking at Ms. Saunders again, $500 million in the bank, something like that. But we got a lot of obligations out there. So I look forward to seeing that as well. Ms. Adams.
Yes, thank you, Chair Clark. As Chair Clark mentioned about the carbon footprint for the city when it comes to our buses and fleets and things like that, I feel very confident that Ms. Helen Paplowski is doing a very good job. We got a new appointed new members coming on in leadership in our sustainability committee. Councilmember Clark, Councilmember Scipio, I think Councilmember Larson, we attended the sustainability roundtable last week. And one of the things at one of the roundtables that I was participating in, when we were talking about, and we had the waste management person of engagement, that we need to now look at, we know that when we grind up the leaves, people run to get the compost, the mulch. It goes away in what, about 2 days, 2.5 days, sold out. But what if we looked at, and I mentioned this to them and Mr. Garrity, that we look at finding a way, as Councilman Clark said, more than 30% of what we get, we end up taking it anyway. I was in a meeting the other day, the extension and Ms. Courtney Driver, of how we're going to extend the landfill to give us another 10 years. More people, more trash, is getting a little out of hand. But if we look at taking, and we got to think out of the box. If we tell people, we're going to give you this bin, like when we started out with waste management, it was a bin. Yes. And we say, you put all of your wet waste, food, in this bin. Then we take it and we create substations within our city. We may start off with a prototype, and people bring their refuge, wet refuge, that can be composted. Okay, we got mulch. Everybody's into gardening. Everybody's into making their lawn look good without buying chemicals. We create our own compost business And that keeps us also from putting things in the landfill. And I told them I feel very confident that that's a good idea because other cities is doing it. So for staff and others, as we move towards the next future with these issues that the council is addressing, we need to start looking again like we did 10 years ago to out of the box. When I came on the council, we were still picking up refuge in the backyard. And we were going through a recession, 2009. We were trying to figure out how to cut costs. And everybody said if we stopped picking up the trash, the city was going to riot. They was going to be down here with pitchforks. And it didn't happen, did it, Mr. Garrity? People will change according to, if you educate them on what's the expectation. Our citizens are very smart. They're very engaged. And I think, Councilmember Clark, as you said, when it comes to all of these things we're juggling, if we just do our job, educate our citizens, they will understand why we have to make some of the decisions where we make. Again, Mr. Tesh, thank you and your staff. Ms. Saunders, thank your staff as well on putting our financials and presentations together for this budget cycle.
Any other questions or comments? Oh, Mr. Mundy had one.
After.
Oh, excuse me, Mr. McIntosh, then Ms. Mundy, and then Ms. Scipio.
I just want to echo Mayor Pro Tem's comments about the quality of the report that we get. It's, spot on, high quality as usual. As we go to state conferences and talk to people from other communities, I'm continually impressed by how good a quality of work we put out. I do appreciate the fact that this is laid out according to our strategic focus. We get to align things and know where our money is going based on what we in prior sessions said was most important to us. So I appreciate that. I do want to bring to people's attention the fact that this LOBS package will keep us from doing another LOBS package for 12 or 13 years, most likely. I mean, our ability to borrow LOBS, if I'm reading that graph correctly.
I would have to ask Ms. Saunders to come up and talk to that, but generally,
Lisa, can I get this?
a lot of that is
Please
dependent
come up,
upon
yeah.
what the conditions in the future look like, revenues and the
The
debt
question is,
service
if we
fund,
do the
such.
LOBS, what is our additional borrowing capacity over the next
Over the next decade.
5-10 years?
If we-
Understanding you only going to be here for 6 more days.
Ask me one more time. I don't think I still understand.
If
the
we do the
question.
LOBS, what will that do to our ability to borrow any money
Going forward.
going forward
Going
without a
forward,
tax?
are you asking me if it will limit our ability
Yes.
to? No, it will not limit our
On
ability
the
going
graph of
forward.
debt service fund reserves, it shows that with this LOBS package, and it's
Yes.
on page 14. Okay, just so tell me, make me feel good about that graph.
So that graph, think of it as being it is our fund balance.
Right.
But it's a stream of our debt payments. So think of our debt payments going away in the future. So if you showed 10 more years, you'd see it coming right back up.
Well, we're worried about the next 10 years.
And so the next 10 years, this is our capacity.
Yeah.
It's a very conservative projection. For example, you would think, well, why is there why is the purple line, why do we have so much fund balance there? Well, when we did the projection years ago, we didn't anticipate all the sales tax money, and there is sales tax money that comes into the debt service fund. So, it's ever changing, the projection going forward. So this is a very, very conservative projection. Our capacity to issue debt today without additional dollars is $55 million. If we wanted to put a tax cent by penny on the tax rate, that would be $30 million additional, dollars in capacity you could borrow. But we're nowhere near the limits of the capacity of what a city of our size could borrow. General obligation bonds, it's 8% of your assessed tax value. We're at 0.69% of our tax value. So we're nowhere near on a GO bond basis reaching a capacity.
My concern is we are not hamstringing future
No,
councils.
we are not.
From
Correct.
That service,
We're not.
great, thank you. And then one last thing, I just want to thank everybody for the focus that we have in this budget on maintenance. We've been pushing for it for years, and I'm really, really proud of our staff and pulling this together and showing us something that will fix what's broken versus going out and buying a bunch of new stuff, so thank you.
Mr. Mundy?
I echo that on maintenance. This is just a reality check. If funding were not a problem or a concern, do we have internally the capacity to achieve all of these things that are in the budget in a year's time?
In terms of achieving, you mean constructing the stuff within a year?
Engineering staff,
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
Staff is going to have to look at the timelines for how these can be handled. Some of the smaller projects, particularly that are already designed, you may be able to see get off the ground and nearing completion, but some of the much larger projects, no. I mean,
The multi-year projects.
yes, absolutely. Bridge replacements may take 12-plus months in design, and then you have to bid them out, take several months to go through that process, and then construction timelines of a year. So many of these projects, you're looking at 2-3-year completions as a forward-thinking.
Okay, so then this becomes a process question for me to understand when I'm looking at a budget. Those items that we put in this year's budget that are multi-years or that don't get done in this year, do they become accrued?
So the city has two basic budget ordinances. One is an annual ordinance, so the general fund, where we fund something every year. All of these capital projects are in a project budget ordinance, which per state law is a multi-year ordinance. So those budgets carry forward throughout the continuation of the project. That funding will always be available until the project is completed or until city council otherwise decides not to do the project or move it to another place.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, because we could sign a contract to build a bridge that may take 2 years.
Yep.
And we certainly wouldn't go halfway through the next year's budget and drop it because the contract is signed.
The other thing that I would say with that is the budget is a reflection of when we make the resources available, and charts like these are a reflection of spending. So we will make the budget available if it were to be passed on July 1, but again, that spending may happen over the course of 2 or 3 years, and then principal and interest payments paid off as the debt is borrowed later.
Okay, just from an accounting standpoint, it's done very differently than your annual operating budget. Okay.
Ms. Scipio, do you have a comment?
Yes, I do thank you again. I concur with everyone's wonderful comments about how well this has been put together. I have two things I would like for us to consider, the staff to consider also. The cost of fuel is going up. I'd like for us to really think about alternative vehicles going electric in our fleet where we can. I don't know if that fuel is going to come down to where it's reasonable for us to continue to pay, but I think we need to looking at more sustainable vehicles in that way. The second concern I have is there are a lot of things in this budget, a lot of unfunded projects. They are actually needed. We need to get these things done. And I just want to make sure, Mr. City Manager, that we feel comfortable that we won't have any real surprises in our operations, our infrastructure that we haven't considered at this time, and they possibly might need to be put in the bond package. Things that we've sort of said, okay, we might can wait another couple of years for this, and boom, there's a surprise. So I just want to make sure we've gotten all of the most critical needs in this package.
Councilman Scipio, I would say that we put everything in there that we know about. And we've also, one of the things on the operating side, one of the reasons we're recommending we hold on to a little extra fund balance is we are worried about the price of fuel as far as the operating budget. Mr. Tess and I were texting about that last night. But in general, as far as the capital budget, these are all the critical things we know about. I would tell you that it does seem, though, that in the stormwater area, which is separate, another major thing seems to fail every month or so. But and we will be back to Mr. McIntosh's committee to talk about, Councilor McIntosh's committee to talk about our long-term stormwater needs this fall. And the reality is we need to look at either probably a borrowing revenue bonds or pay as you go. But in either case, we'll be talking about the need to raise our stormwater fees as well to cover that.
But that'll be in the October timeframe, maybe?
I think that sounds right, yeah.
Okay. Mr. Tesh, we got another meeting at 7 o'clock. If you'll please let everybody know what's going to happen then.
At 7 o'clock will be the public hearing. So we will have a very brief presentation and then have comments from the public with regard to the 23 budget.
So if there's anyone out there that would like to comment to the Finance Committee at 7 o'clock tonight, we will meet in the same room, same place, and you'll have an opportunity to comment. Mr. John, you got a question, comment?
One quick question. We're dedicating, the citizen survey drew attention to streets as one of the primary needs, and I compliment your effort to really send a lot of resources, millions of dollars into improving our streets. How quickly do you envision, or do we envision being able to start implementing the street improvements with the passing of this budget? Is that something that we're going to be able to make significant improvement in the next year on?
Councilmember Larson, that we've got a street resurfacing, the annual street resurfacing contract coming to you in June for this year's appropriation.
Great.
And we'll be immediately working on a fall list like we do usually twice a year. So we'll be looking immediately to working with all of you on the prioritization of streets based on the amount of lives we have, the capacity we have to do additional street resurfacing. That one of the biggest challenge we're having right now with street resurfacing is asphalt is the main cost is from fuel, and fuel is way up in price.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's my concern. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no other comments, we will adjourn and meet back at 7 o'clock in this room. Thank everybody very much. We're adjourned.